and welcome everybody to the second in the series, Considerations and Strategies for Running Clinical Trials During COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm Shani Dyer, I'm the CEO of ARCS, and I'm going to be chairing the session today. So welcome back to people who were with us in part one, and welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. I can hear myself, so if anybody is there who needs to go on mute, please do so now. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm very pleased to say that MTP Connect has come on board as a sponsor for this series. I think it's very important for us that MTP Connect, who are the industry growth centre for medtech, pharmaceuticals and biotechnology companies in Australia, recognise the importance of this, and they support us in a number of other ways. And thank you to MTP Connect for coming on board for this very important series. Next slide, please. So just for you, for the folk who haven't been on before, this just gives you some understanding of the housekeeping. We're going to do a series of presentations and then we're going to be opening up to questions. You'll be able to see on your panel that there is an opportunity to type in to write your questions. Please get those coming through, and we will triage those and make sure that of the groups of questions that come through, we will ensure that we will get those ones answered for you. This session will be recorded by us, but I do please ask you not to record any part of the event yourselves. We are under very strict permissions from our government colleagues in relation to recordings, so please don't do that. Okay, so next slide, please. So this series was set up in response to the event of this pandemic. It's really important that we respond in an appropriate way to what is happening to us currently. So whilst we're giving out information here, I will remind you that the one true source of information is health.gov.au. And they're the ones that are going to be keeping us abreast of things that are changing. When I say that too, I want to say to you out there that your physical and mental health is also so important. As they say on the aircrafts that we haven't been on for some time now, in an emergency, masks will drop and oxygen released. Please secure your own mask before looking after others. This means that unless you manage your own health, you'll not be able to function as well as you can. So I do hope that everybody is looking after themselves during this, what is identified as a very stressful time. Next slide, please. So we've taken the approach of looking at clinical trials and their delivery during this time from different views of different stakeholders, and we feel that having a broad and effective communication is really important when people are isolated, working from home, and we're doing this to really keep the communications open. Whilst I say we've got a series set, I will say that we're adopting and changing to suit the requirements of the sector. So if things do change, then that's for a very, very, very good reason. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about us, because I know a lot of people on this call are not ARCS members. We're an individual membership-based organisation that looks at professional development and career pathways for people working in our sector across clinical research, regulatory affairs, pharmacovigilance, health economics, all the areas that, and more, all the areas that are involved in delivering innovative therapies to Australia and to the patients who are our primary goal. So we're very keen to ensure that, that we maintain clinical trials and access to everybody for clinical trials. As I said, there will be opportunity for questions and questions that we'll answer later on. Next slide, please. Just wanted to remind you, for all this audience, it's going to be very relevant as well, that we've got the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework webinar coming up on the 7th of April. That will be delivered by Dr. Bernadette Alibrandi Costa, and I'd encourage you to register for that. So last week we heard from clinical sites and their response to COVID-19. We heard from research managers and clinical trial pharmacists, and particularly Rob Kent from the Kinghorn Cancer Centre based at St Vincent's Hospital, Sydney. Just in speaking with him after that, he was, saying that things had changed very quickly. And so he will be giving a short update to us in a moment. But next slide, please. So it's been really horrific that the new cases are continuing to increase, and it's still staggering that the number of infections that we're seeing. There does seem to be a little bit of a drop, but I'm sure Rob will go into that in more detail about what does it really mean. So that's going to be very important. We also said that we would be doing a survey. The survey was a set of questions to collect information to understand what's happening out there, and it's been very interesting. We've done a bit of analysis up front and of the questions that we saw, and you can see all the questions if you go on and do the survey. But when you look at the issues that people are facing, just jumping out for us is patient recruitment and retention, understanding how clinical monitoring is going to work, and protocol compliance. Those were the questions that people answered were the most impactful for them. Look, it's not surprising, and you can see that these would be the issues that are of issue. And it's good to have this information, because then we can do something about it, and we can talk with the government and make sure that everything that we can do to address it will be addressed. Next slide. So one of the things I wanted to do also was just to see, well, what's happening around the rest of the world in relation to trials, and we've got some information from Global Data, who are a partner of ARC's, and they've provided some summary information. Next slide. So what was interesting was to see, that already there are COVID studies up and running, and this gives us hope that of these studies, we will get some results that will show that we can do something in relation to COVID, both from the vaccine perspective, which will come a bit later probably, but also looking at various drugs that are effective in treating the symptoms of COVID. Next slide. So if we look at the drugs by phase of development, obviously the majority of numbers are still in discovery, which won't be happening for us in any short time, but a good number coming into preclinical, and a small number in phase 1. Next slide, please. Routes of administration, not hard to understand. Intravenous administration and oral are the two highest. Next slide, please. And isn't it amazing that biologics are the standouts for looking at this disease, followed by vaccines. So these are not going to be simple trials, so hopefully we'll get through those quickly. Next slide, please. So top targets, interleukin from an inflammatory perspective, RNA polymerase, and a whole range of those, which are not not ones that you would be surprised about, but it's just interesting to see small numbers, but they're the drugs that are looking really at the symptoms. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So that's just a little bit of an update, just trying to pull together what's happening out and around there. I'll now hand it over to Rob Kent, who's going to give us an update on what he's seeing out there and at the clinic. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks very much, Shani. So when we presented last week on Monday, the numbers of new diagnosed patients were peaking. This implemented several layers of responses that we needed to implement over the next few days of last week. Next slide. I presented our action plan, which classified it into 3 main areas of management. We're still currently running at green, but we've had to. This is a basic framework that allows us to be flexible to manage certain instances as required. Next slide. I've just included the key points of our framework just for reference. I won't go through them right now, but the main thing is to consider is as we are making these changes to our process, if we are indeed flattening the curve, then this could put a lot of our restrictions, put it out for months, if not a year or more, until we can find a vaccine or another treatment. So we were implementing processes now that we may need to carry on for quite a period of time to make sure that our patients can be maintained safely and the data is collected is accurate and of value. Next slide. Next slide. So key changes this week we've had with the closures of the borders and the restrictions of movement have created key issues with us at the Kinghorn Centre. We've had widespread reduction in services, access to scans, access to the departments. Institution is now preparing with planned redeployments. The centre has now been closed to external monitors, and our team management is while working from home. We're trying to keep a healthy workforce by keeping up to 70% of our staff from home, working from home, and rotating them on blocks of days so that we have time to identify early symptoms should they become infected. We have limited access to PPE, so we have been sourcing our own hand sanitizer. Now, this is not we could get it, but as a precaution, we are actually sourcing our own to make sure that our staff are prepared in case that there is strains on the system. And we have next slide. So as part of it, we are increasing our virtual team meetings and department meetings. All of them are done through Skype for Business and through the telehealth system. We are getting in external agency staff to manage some of the clinical processes inside the system so that our staff who are at higher risk, like pregnant staff, older staff, do not have to come in contact with patients on a day-to-day basis, and keeps our staff healthy in case things escalate. We have an active workforce to come in and take over. We're upskilling some of our non-clinical staff who may not be affected by the redeployment. So we're taking some of our data managers and we're training them up to carry out certain coordinator functions. Our admin assistants are being uptrained to work as data entry, and and select non-clinical staff are now being trained to manage processing and shipping. We're taking it from individual care through to a team care approach, which is mapping out our patients' visits and then working as teams on certain days to make sure that all visit care is maintained. And part of this is increasing our visit tracking and planning. Next slide. So a particular issue with our patients is that we have a very large proportion of interstate and rural patients. 40% of our patients live greater than 300 kilometres from the TKCC. This is giving us, with the restrictions in movement, this is causing us extra logistical issues. All non-central testing is completed out in the community where possible. We are implementing the telehealth, limiting numbers of recruitment based on patient need, and we're looking at it on a case-by-case basis. We are implementing our model of telehealth, teletrials, and we're utilising our e-consent. Next slide. So under the teletrial model, we we were able to initiate our own version of the teletrial model. We're using the vendor model, which has been developed over the last 18 months. This allows us to do vendor contracts with multiple health facilities, couriers, imaging, and laboratories. We are now acting on these to provide clinical services in closer to patients' actual homes, and allows us to deliver drugs directly to the patients. Without using the REDCap system, we utilize eSource. We can, in advance under our contract, we can send through electronic data capture interfaces where the local staff can actually complete the data collection for us just as part of their standard clinical practice. This is then saved back on the server in St Vincent's, where we can actually allow localized monitoring, centralized monitoring here within the institution. Face-to-face visits of our telehealth and our e-consent is now approved using the REDCap system for all Bellberry approved phase 1 trials, and for 2 other projects we've now consented up to 70 patients using that system. Next slide. So the investigator product, we are now distributing it via a courier, though one of the first products went out last week through to Merimbula. That did cost us $1,300 per delivery, so we are looking at other ways of streamlining it and reducing costs around the delivery. These processes are like multi-cycle dispensation, to providing 3 cycles in advance with strict controls on restarting at every cycle after a telehealth consult. Developing our own mobile research services. We're looking at taking some of our coordinators and taking the service to the patient in their homes. Pre-dispensing the product so it's ready on site, so that patients arrive, it's ready to go and reduces their time on site. And as discussed last week, we're treating all returns of IP as biological waste, and we no longer retain it for sponsors' reconciliation. We have a strong SOPs and process in place to manage that. Next slide. For all SIVs, SEVs are now virtual only. Monitoring has halted as of yesterday. We've introduced a remote monitoring service, which will bring in extra staff to manage the de-identification and redaction of medical records for safety monitoring. And we're implementing our eSite file using trial docs, where we'll be able to allow remote access to the site's file and remote access to redacted trial patient records in a secure system. Next slide. So what the key messages from this presentation is we want to keep our research is treatment. We've currently got over 15 patients who came in as last treatment option who are alive up to 2 years later. And this treatment is not something that we can stop readily. I mean, there's no point putting at risk our patients of dying from the disease to prevent them dying from the virus. We look for flexibility from our sponsors and our institutions to allow us to operate safely and within the guidelines, but have flexibility to implement many of the changes that we have got to provide to make our processes work. And we want collaboration to implement these changes for the mid to long term if required. Thanks, Shani. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you so much, Rob. That was really terrific. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, actually, I think. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to hear from a number of speakers representing government in relation to the Clinical Trial Project Reference Group, which is chaired by Professor Chris Brook. As part of the Department of Health, we will also hear from Jeremy Kenner, who's from the NHMRC, and Terry O'Brien from the Department of Health to answer any questions that we might get. We also have Peter Komotsky from Medicine Australia and Sarah May from Therapeutics Goods Administration. So to start off with, I'd like to present Chris Brook, who's going to give us an update, particularly in reference to the position statement that's been recently released by the Clinical Trial Project Reference Group. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Shani. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Hello? Good.
Yes, Chris.
Look,
yeah.
I'd like to just, if I could, run through the COVID-19 guidance statement and hopefully then answer any questions that people may have. The speed of change which COVID has brought is said to be unprecedented, and I certainly think it is. Hello? Hello?
Yep,
We
keep
can hear
going,
you
Chris.
flawlessly.
Yeah.
Something weird going on here. Just over a week ago, and it does seem like yesterday, but also a long time ago, CTPRG with the Commonwealth and others, CTPRG being Clinical Trials Project Reference Group, determined that we really needed to get a move along and issue the best possible shot we could give of national level guidelines to assist both institutions, sponsors, researchers and participants in doing two things essentially. First being ensuring safety at all levels and for all parties, and secondly, where possible, streamlining appropriate approvals and governance processes to enable COVID-directed research to proceed as swiftly as possible. Now, this all sits on the background of a lot of work over a long period of time in improving and hopefully expediting governance processes and approvals for clinical trials in Australia. But that's for another day. In fact, we'll be addressing that on April the 7th, I think. So I haven't produced slides because really to understand this, you just need to read the guidance statement, and hopefully you all have that. If not, go to health.gov.au/clinical trials, and it's right there in front of you. First thing to say is safety, safety, and safety are the three most important words. So it's not just safety to participants, but to the whole of the effort that might include the institution in which a trial is taking place, recognising that trials are taking place in all form of institutions, not necessarily hospitals, not necessarily public anything. The second purpose or scope is to address prioritisation of clinical trials research. CTPRG comprises all jurisdictions, including the Commonwealth. It also includes NH and MRC and TGA. So it's a very useful group to try and bring together national level advice, though there is a clearance process after that from each jurisdiction and our own Lords and Masters. The guidance in this document is not legal, not legally binding. Certainly it can't be. CTPRG is a reference group and it's a cooperative group, and it doesn't have jurisdiction over what happens in any particular institution. So just want to move through it. There are several sections and we try and address things systematically. The first of it is contingency planning. And contingency planning must be undertaken by everybody at every level, and it's a continual process. It needs to address three basic things. Priority, what is the priority of that trial, including, for example, continuing trials. Participation, do you have the ability of participants to participate in a trial, including looking at alternative models, and capacity. Moving right along, communication, of course, is paramount. And in the case of this guidance and this statement, regular updating is required. That's obvious. We've had requests for change even a week later, and those requests will certainly be assessed and accommodated where possible, recognising that very many people will have specific issues that may not be best addressed by this process. Okay, so when it comes to participants, a lot of information is already coming in about problems that are associated with participants continuing in a trial or being able to participate at all in a trial. I guess the basic message is a fairly obvious one. People have the right to leave a trial if the circumstances of the trial have changed, and that means without question, because of the nature of the interaction even. But if the trial changes or because of their own desire, participants have to be able to, given the clear option, to continue to suspend their participation or withdraw. If a patient does decline to take part of the trial and they can't participate by will, then, well, that decision needs to be respected, but eventually they will need to be informed and be asked to withdraw from the trial. There are lots of other issues here, including moving on to ordinary standard of care, and indeed how to make sure that happens, but it's all written down. Moving on to patients who become or are symptomatic for COVID-19. If they are experiencing symptoms or they have returned from overseas or been in close contact with someone who is known to have contracted COVID-19, of course, the return from overseas has become much bigger a test, much tougher since this was written, then they need to be assessed and perhaps treated, but not on site and not as part of the existing trial. Clearly, decisions need to be made about how to recruit new participants, and that needs to take into account the burden on the healthcare system, particularly as the burden of disease is growing every single day. And at all times, alternative models for conducting clinical trials, including remote monitoring, decentralized trials or teletrials, or hybrid models, need to be thought through, and HRECs need to be both sensitive and commonsensical, as in pragmatic, about such changes. And I think, as the previous speaker said, from all I can hear, a very large number of sites have already stopped in-house monitoring and are moving virtually completely to remote monitoring wherever possible. There's a section then on what we think should happen with serious adverse events, significant safety issues, etc. And that includes somebody who actually succumbs, or I shouldn't say succumbs, should I, but develops COVID and may have actually been at a site and monitored, and what the implications are then for the trial itself and all of the other staff and researchers available. I'll just move to continuation of trial medication. We heard a little bit about that just before. Continuation of delivery of trial medication to participants on existing trials can be really, really tricky, and there's no simple way around it. New South Wales was looking at was asked whether we could set up a national scheme to do that, and the answer is no, not really. It's just not logistically possible, and people will have to work hard to work out the best way that they can continue to deliver much needed IMPs or other treatment, including standard of care treatment as needed. Now, TGA has been very open to looking to simplify approaches to how they view any changes to the trial. And for the most part, it doesn't need to approve, or you don't need to notify if you're simply changing the supply of an IMP or certain issues arising from potential quarantine and travel restrictions. Likewise, the change in the number, change in PI, and number of day and trial start and finish date don't require much change, but they do require notification. And of course, changes to the protocol under the CTX scheme do need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. Mentioned earlier, remote monitoring visits are not only encouraged, they're actually practically happening in all cases that I can tell. And obviously, the same should apply to investigator meetings as applies to everybody else, just not face-to-face. HRECs are strongly recommended to be sensible, and whilst fulfilling their responsibilities, should not be rigid. And I'm well aware that people often say that the processes are bureaucratic. I can assure you that we are doing our bit to try and make sure through jurisdictions, through NHMRC, through TGA, that the process is as pragmatic as possible and is flexible wherever possible. So for new trials, we do want expedited processes for research relating to COVID-19 or where there are public health grounds for rapid review. And I'm pleased to say that whilst we have urged extraordinary meetings of HRECs where possible, this is already happening, and the system of prioritisation and streamlining is really very much coming into place in most of the jurisdictions that I can tell, in most institutions within them. I think we also encourage everybody to think about novel approaches to the conduct of clinical trials, and we also want people to be really, really careful, and as right at the start of this, to look at capacity as one of the key issues, so that the impact of the proposed research on institutional resources, not just on the individual patients or participants, but the impact on institutional resources must be carefully thought through at the start of proposing any new research. There's other little bits and pieces, but I think that probably covers the ground reasonably. So I will stop there and wait for any questions you may have.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. And perhaps so people can put their questions down on the chat line. But I might just put out to Mel Hagan, if Mel is the co-chair of the Clinical Trial Collaborative Forum. Mel, have you got any comments to make to that?
Sorry, just unmuted. Not really, but just to say that things are changing very quickly. New South Wales has provided some additional guidance, and Queensland is just about to do the same thing. And that's just going through the process of approval for release. But we certainly are moving really. I can't imagine ever having thought that we could have moved so quickly at doing streamlined governance reviews. Ethics has been turned around in a matter of a day or two. The approach with the trying to look at virtual ways of monitoring, overcoming issues, we're trying to be as innovative as possible by making sure that developing models so that we're taking as much out of a clinical trial outside of the hospital setting as possible. So I think that's all I'd like to say. I think I'll leave it to others because I don't know, Shani, whether you're going to be talking about some of the activities that ARCS is going to try and do with the R&D task force as well. So I'll just leave that.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll leave that at this stage. Thanks very much, Mel. Look, I might go trying to get through this period of time, so I might move on to Jeremy Kenner. So next slide, please. So Jeremy is from the NHMRC. He's an expert advisor for ethics for the Research Quality and Priorities branch, and responsible and contributes to a broad range of programs and projects related to health and research, ethics and governance, and provides advice internally, externally on other matters. So, so we've invited Jeremy to just give an update on behalf of the NHMRC. Thank you, Jeremy.
Yes, hello. Just checking that audio is okay.
Yeah, beautiful.
Okay, good. Yes, well, thank you for the invitation to be part of this, and thanks to ARCS for everything that you do and will be doing to help us through this this time. So from the NHMRC, we of course, as Chris mentioned, are part of the are members of the Clinical Trials Project Reference Group, and and we're part of the development of the statement that he just reviewed. And as Mel mentioned, a couple of jurisdictions at least have either released or will be releasing additional guidance that that covers more operational matters that the guidance does not cover. I will just go back to the guidance for a moment, just to highlight a couple of things that are you know in sort of in the remit of the NHMRC. And that is just to tell folks that one of the overall, let's call it attitude that we'll be taking, and I'm along with others, I'm sure, is kind of summarized in the slide that's in front of you, which is flexibility, good sense, consultation, and supportive of the use of creative and streamlined strategies for doing just about everything that is covered by the guidance, the guidelines and codes and standards that NHMRC develops. And that's just common sense, really. This includes some of the things that HRECs and researchers often get caught on with respect to approval processes, all of these things that can be done now, arguably could always have been done. And the national statement is sufficiently flexible to permit them. And so one of the things we may see, of course, is that some of the strategies that have been adopted to address this time period will carry over into when we return to some semblance of normal. And the attitudes that we develop of not being overly rigid about our interpretation of guidance hopefully will become the dominant cultural motif after this period. So we are available at NHMRC to answer folks' questions. We're already fielding some queries, and we expect to get quite a few more regarding how HRECs can operate and what kind of processes can be employed to ease the burden on researchers and participants and the sector as a whole. So we're available for that. There's an ethics@nhmrc.gov.au inbox, which you can write to if you have any questions for us on the sort of ethics and governance sort of issues that we've traditionally dealt with. Please take advantage of that opportunity if you'd like to. You also will be aware that NHMRC is involved in a variety of funding schemes, funding grant schemes. These are all, of course, being assessed in light of current events. A statement has been put out by the CEO and Kelso to the sector regarding what position we're taking with respect to each of these schemes. That may change, but at the moment it some decisions have been made, and you can have a look at those by logging on to the NHMRC website, and I'm sure there are other places where this advice will be made available. I'm not sure that there's much more to say from the NHMRC's standpoint. Just to encourage folks that we are often considered to be a regulator in this space, and we are not, in fact, a regulatory body. We provide guidelines and standards, but not regulation. And so it would be appropriate to take the approach that flexibility is the dominant strategy to be taking to address the issues that you need to address. I'll stop there, and also thank Chris for summarizing the statement well. And if there are any questions, please.
Sure. Great. Thanks very much, Jeremy. And yeah, please, we'll get the questions towards the end. So I'd like to call on now Peter Komotsky, who's the Manager for Industry and Regulatory Policy at Medicines Australia. Peter is standing in for Liz de Soma, who was called off for an urgent meeting. You can understand there's quite a lot going on at the moment. So Peter has been working closely with us and the other associations, and particularly through the R&D task force, and has been particularly great to work with. So Pete's going to talk through the view from Medicines Australia and also the position statement that the R&D task force put out on behalf of Medicines Australia, MTAA and AusBiotech. Thank you, Peter.
And thank you, Shani, and hello everyone. Look, in the interest of time, I'll try to be as quick as possible. MA represents generally the larger pharmaceutical innovative companies that are doing R&D in Australia and globally. No doubt many of you work with my members, and I think that the message that they're sending is the same message that we are sending through the statement that we produced as well. And that is that we're here to support you, to work with you, and to make sure that where it's safe for patients and staff, that you remain open and that you keep doing all the great work that you're doing. Now, I have a slideshow here. It has all of 3 slides, including the title one. So this won't take long to get through, and I won't dwell on it either. The statement that we developed through the R&D task force really does emphasise that we as industry are here to support. I won't go through everything in the interest of time. I'm sure Shani has or will distribute that one to you. But at the end of the day, the message aligns with that of the CTRPG. We, as Chris said, their statement was developed by the CTPRG, governments, NHMRC and others, and those others include the R&D task force, and we thank you for your cooperation and collaboration. And our own messaging was in order to complement and align and ensure that we're all on the same page and moving forward as we address more specific issues. It will obviously be good to make sure that the alignment and cooperation continues. And from everything I've seen in the last few weeks of working across industry, not just in this sector, but across medicine shortages and supply chains, whether it be across the industry with distributors and pharmacies and government, there's been an enormous amount of collaboration and goodwill, and everybody recognises that the issues in front of us are bigger than all of us, and so we're tackling an enemy bigger than us that needs to be tackled together. So in terms of our own statement, we certainly looked at basically the both ethics committees and sites and sponsors need to be as flexible and as open to change as possible. It's certainly encouraging to hear Jeremy say that the strategies and practices that have we've developed now and that we're adapting to, things that may well become permanent in the future. I guess necessity is the mother of all invention, and by necessity, we're doing things that we know that we could and should have done earlier, but broader national rollout and harmonisation takes longer, and I think we're fast forwarding that process a little bit, and I hope that continues. And I also hope that the statements and further guidance from the states is not only consistent with the national statements that we're all making, but that they're also consistent between the states as well, because you can interpret things in a variety of ways that are still consistent with an overarching statement, but then in practice things become difficult, and when our clinical trials are being undertaken across state boundaries, things can become a little difficult. So just returning to the statement and the presentation here, I think that the things that are of most interest to folks at the moment are that ethics committees remain flexible and allow for changes where things are safe and sensible, and in particular that relates to all of the remote sort of work that we're doing, whether it's clinical trial staff working remotely, whether it's patients being accessed and monitored remotely, whether the medicines and treatments are being provided to them directly rather than them having to come in and so on. All of that is important, and all of that we should work on together. So
Fantastic.
to this slide as well, and just to really, I'll finish off, and if we can move to the next slide as well. At the end of the day, we want sites to continue to remain open and function to the extent possible. The R&D task force is here to help folks, and you can reach out to us so that we can get a better understanding as to what particular guidance folks require, and we can work with the government in order to develop that advice. It's critical that we remain open to be able to treat patients that currently need it, so trials can continue happening where possible, so that we're ready to upscale again when this COVID issue is dealt with, but also so that we're ready to trial new vaccines and treatments and so on as they come to Australia, and to ensure that we remain internationally competitive in this space, so that those trials do come back here and that they do come here, and so that investment continues to flow into Australia, so that you all remain employed, so that our skill set is at the highest levels and at the forefront of world-leading technology. So at that, I will. Thanks, Shani.
Thank you so much, Pete. Excellent. So look, let's they're all good words, and yeah, the concept of clinical trials must continue. So let's now hear from Sarah May, who's the acting co-director responsible for clinical trial access pathways. She's speaking on behalf of Dr. Grant Pegg, who had to move on. So I'll hand over to you, Sarah, for your words from the TGA.
Okay, great. Can everyone hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. So good afternoon. Today I'd like to briefly talk to you about the TGA's stance on clinical trials during this pandemic. If you could just go to the next slide. So our priorities, we know that things are moving very quickly in relation to new investigations and trials for the prevention and treatment of COVID-19. And really the message I want you to take home or away from this is that we are prioritising any clinical trials for COVID, for treatment or prevention. So they are considered a priority by the TGA, and any inquiries regarding COVID-19 are responded to by the TGA team as a priority. We need you to communicate with us if your new clinical trial falls into this category, so it is in relation to COVID. So that is, once you've submitted the online CTN form and paid your fee, please contact the clinical trials team so that we can ensure that it is processed with priority. If you just move on to the next slide. I won't talk about this. Chris spoke about this very thoroughly in his presentation. So go to the next slide. So a little bit about the CTN scheme. We're talking mainly about the CTN scheme rather than the clinical trials exemption scheme, as the CTN scheme is a likely pathway for any COVID clinical trials. And the vast majority of clinical trials undertaken in Australia are conducted through the CTN scheme. It is a notification scheme, so all material relating to the proposed trial, including the trial protocol, must be directly submitted to the HRAC, not to us. We do not request this as part of the notification. We just require you to fill out the 4-page form. And under the therapeutic goods regulation, once the CTN form is submitted to the TGA and the fee has been paid, the trial is deemed to be notified. You are then legally able to start the trial. However, some ethics committees and approving authorities do require the TGA acknowledgement prior to commencement, so we are also getting these out as a priority. Just as a note, we will accept CTN form submissions while the sponsor is still obtaining any required approvals from the Human Research Ethics Committee or approving authorities, particularly related to COVID. If you go on to the next page. So we know that there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, and this is affecting the continuation of approved clinical trials and changes in protocols. We are trying to be really pragmatic in our approach to any changes needed to such trials and really flexible, like all the other agencies at the moment. So in recognition of the impact of COVID-19, we have advised as part of the COVID-19 statement that trial sponsors do not need to submit variations for situations that you don't normally require a fee for. So these are changes to the start or finish date, number of participants. However, any variations that are quite significant, so this might be changes to the existing therapeutic good, an addition of a therapeutic good or addition of sites, do still need to be notified to the TGA. Next slide, please. So I've just provided our contact details here. And I just want to reiterate that we aim to work with sponsors and get clinical trials initiated for COVID treatment or prevention. We also are trying to allow the continuation, any changes or suspensions of current clinical trials in this uncertain climate. We are being as pragmatic in a response to this pandemic as we can be, and are trying to be flexible to your requirements as well. Please communicate with us if you need any advice, particularly related to your specific circumstances or your trial circumstances. We are responding to many inquiries already and adjusting our communication accordingly. So this afternoon, hopefully, we are putting out a new web and guidance update in relation to clinical trial processes due to COVID-19. So that should be up on the TGA website, hopefully this afternoon. And that's all I really had to say. So if there were any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. That's terrific. And just the fact that, and having spoken to a number of people at TGA, they really are open and looking to be helpful. So please contact them if you need. So let's open up for discussion, and I'll pass it over to Sue Mason, who's going to manage the questions. Sue, can you, and I know we've had a number of them, we won't be able to probably get through them all, but let's just get some of the key ones out there. Over to you, Sue. Sue, can you ask some of the questions, please?
So we are showing you are in an unmuted line, so feel free to speak aloud if you can, or send in a message.
Shannon, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Joe.
Sorry, Sue must be having a technical issue. Maybe I will start the Q&A.
That would be great, thank you.
Yes, no problem. There's one here for you, Sarah. Will COVID-19 CTN notifications be likely to be released sooner than the usual 10-day turnaround time?
Yeah, so we're doing them within about 1 day at the moment. So as I said, they are a priority, that we're working to get them out as soon as we possibly can. Some of the hold up has been the payment of the fee. So that's a legal requirement that the fee has been paid. So we're having to chase some sponsors to get that done in order to get those through our system.
I think this one here also is to you. I think you may have addressed it. Do we need to inform the TGA if there is a recruitment hold on the trial for either CTN or CTXs due to the COVID-19 situation?
No. No, you don't, not at the moment. So if it's anything related to the COVID-19 situation and isn't one of the normal situations where you are required to notify and pay a fee, you do not need to notify at this point.
Thank you. Now, I have one here for you, Melissa. Hopefully you're still on the line. Melissa, you mentioned New South Wales and Queensland are producing additional guidances. Are you aware of any updates specifically from Victoria?
No, I'm sorry, I don't know if there's anything. I don't think they are planning at this point, but they don't have anything at this moment.
Yeah, and I can just back it up, Joe. It's Shani here. They are not planning to.
I think it's more of a broad question, so I might just ask it, and then those of you on the panel, we'd welcome your thoughts. What longer term impact do you think this pandemic will have on implementing ERMs within Australia, as we are a long way behind the US and other markets being able to use these technologies to facilitate such systems as remote monitoring? Mel, I might bring you in. Do you have a view on this before going around the panel?
Yeah, sure. So the ERM system allows for virtual ethics meetings, but it doesn't have a monitoring component.
Sorry, EMR, my mistake. I think they're talking about electronic medical records specifically.
Oh, okay. So EMR systems at the moment in Queensland, we have a Cerner system, and there are other sort of variations across Australia. All I can say is that within Queensland Health, we are investigating ways to use the system as it is to facilitate remote monitoring, and that could be simple things like we have an issue that we can't lock down individual patients to a system, so a person has sort of unfettered access to our IMR. If we give them access, it can't be locked down. So what we are looking at doing is maybe implementing options such as direct supervision of monitors when they're accessing systems, and then also providing access, whether it's through some electronic site doc sort of system or other way, to any hard copies that are in the medical record beside the IMR. So I can unequivocally say that remote monitoring will become more of the norm, and all of the issues that maybe we thought were insurmountable won't seem so over the next few months.
Thanks, Mel.
If I could just add quickly.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I think if you look at how telehealth has been rolled out seemingly overnight, so that your average patient can see your average GP, and given that otherwise that seemed quite a long way off, I think in some way we've adapted here quite quickly, and again, it shows you how quickly you can do these things when you really have to. And sure, this is essentially the condensed pilot version thereof, and we should certainly make sure that we take advantage of it while, as we can, because silver linings, being what they are. I'll leave that there.
So, Joe, any other questions?
We do. Just coming in thick and fast, just bear with me. There's a general question here, I think, on telehealth. Can I ask a question around more standardized telehealth approaches? Currently, everyone is doing what everyone is doing something specific for their own studies, it would be good to look forward to a standardised model and approach. Who's happy to jump in there?
I am. It's Melissa. So there is a standardised approach to trials. It's called Tally Trials, and it's based on a framework that was introduced by COSA in 2016, and we've been piloting it over the last few years, and now we've released the Australian Tally Trials model. Now that's being considered by NMA and was to be reviewed by CTPRG in March. So there is a specific suite of standard operating procedures where ICH GCP accommodates teletrials in a standardised way. There's been a number of trials that have run through that process. So we can provide links to those standard operating procedures to anyone who wants, and there's really clear guidance around how you consent, how you deal with trial master files, how you deal with monitoring and SDV using that model.
I might just thanks, Mel. Thanks. Sorry about that. I just know we're short, so I didn't mean to jump in on your last point there. I do have one for Jeremy here before handing maybe back. There are quite a lot of meetings, a lot of questions. I think in the past what we've done is triage these and then provided responses in a more formal way. But Jeremy, there's one for you. For a project funded by NHMRC, do we need to let NHMRC know of the changes to protocols after ethics approval?
Thanks for that. I can't give you a precise answer. This is a different branch of the NHMRC that handles these sorts of things, but I can say that what we don't know is whether the threshold for what's going to be required and no longer required, and for the time being, where that threshold lies. And so the best that we can do is to ask that you direct the question to us, and by email we'll get a response for you and respond to you as quickly as we can. And the address I suggest that you use for us is ethics@nhmrc.gov.au, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can.
Excellent. There's a question here around links to telehealth models would be welcome. I just would say to those on the line is that if you go to the ARC's website, there actually is a resource page where we are including all useful resources supporting work we're doing here in COVID-19. So I will follow up separately and include any relevant links there for those of you who are interested in those models to get more information.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joe. And look, I think in the time that we've got now, we might have to wrap this up. With the further questions that we have, what we'll do is we'll put those out onto our website. You go to the next slide, just to remind everybody that we've got another. Can you please go to the next slide? We've got another session next week from the jurisdictions, and I think some of the questions that you've probably got for people here today will be answered by the people at a jurisdictional level. So let's look at that for next week. Thank you so much to all speakers we've had today. Thank you for your time and your input, and we'll wrap this up. This webinar has been recorded, and we'll make that available on our website. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.